Hello, and welcome to Leadership in Real Life. My name is Erika Taylor Beck, and I am the host of the show, but also the founder of Authentic Foundations. And today I have a special guest, Nicole Matteson. Nicole, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Happy to be here, Erica. I'm Nicole Matteson. I've grown up in the HR profession, have over 20 years of HR experience, both in the private and public sector, kind of encompassing corporate retail and SaaS companies, as well as spending 12 years working in higher ed.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Which is why I brought Nicole on the show today. This is a topic that has been requested by a couple of folks. It is about compensation conversations. And the reason that we are recording this kind of off schedule is because of the timeliness of the topic. Typically, compensation convos happen shortly after annual reviews, which is end of the year or starting early in the next year. So this is something that we wanted to get out there to help some leaders to be able to address some of these conversations because while it might seem like they're easy and fun to give people money, sometimes they don't go as planned, especially if there are budget constraints, performance challenges, or if the employee was expecting more money than what they are getting. So, Nicole, being the HR badass that she is, has volunteered to join me today to talk through some tips and some best practices to handle compensation conversations. Before we move forward, I wanted to just clarify as well that this is a little bit different in every organization. So this information is not necessarily going to apply to everyone 100%. So take what resonates and use it. And if it doesn't resonate, you can ignore it. But if you have any specific questions, speak with your own leader or your own HR professional. All
Good
right.
catch.
Fun to just little disclaimer out there. So one thing, Nicole, for me in the past, it felt like these conversations, they generally happen one time a year. And so it feels like there's this big lead up to merit increase or compensation time. What can managers do to better prepare employees throughout the year so that this isn't such a big event?
Yeah, I think my first thing would be as a manager to make sure you're educating yourself on the practices, the policies, the philosophies of the company that you're working for. Because, we all typically work for someone else, and it might not be how we would choose to do things, or the order of operations isn't how we would see it through if we were owning our own companies. So I think making sure first that you fully understand and get on board with the company's policies and procedures that you're working with. And that will help kind of drive where you're going next. And I think that this should always be a proactive conversation to understand what motivates people. Not everybody is motivated by money. Many of us are, and we're not going to say no to receiving a pay increase, but noting if that's the biggest motivator or if it's just something that's a nice to have for people is important. And also understanding the career path goals and aspirations. Are you happy where you're at and you would just want to grow in breadth and depth and earn more money doing what you're doing? Or are you looking for those bigger jumps to get you, some stretch goals that would then lead to more compensation? So starting those conversations early and often, setting the expectations of what exists in your company and what your company's policies and procedures are, and then leading into how that drives how merit pay or compensation changes work at your company.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I love kind of talking to them, you said, often throughout the year so that the expectations are set so that way they don't have this big build up to what might be kind of a crash. So I think that's great to meet with them frequently to talk through those goals. So you also kind of talked about something else that I wanted to touch on, which is preparing themselves for these conversations. You talked about policies and procedures and how their company does it or their organization. One thing for me that was helpful from just past experience was knowing a little bit more about the total value prop. So the whole compensation, not just salary, because sometimes people forget about that piece. So, what other things can managers do or learn to have in their toolkit to be ready to have these conversations?
I think it's forming a deeper understanding of what tools your company is using. So whether they're using salary surveys, if they're benchmarking against, local companies or local markets, or if they're more on a national scale, and then drilling down to how compensation is delivered? Do you do an across the board annual pay adjustment and then, go off of that, either higher or lower based on performance scores and rating scales? Or are they looking at compensation equity and compression issues? So you understand if you have more flexibility to do, say, an in range adjustment for somebody. And then also thinking, and I think we'll probably touch on this in the future too, on how transparent the company you're working for is, and really knowing where the guidelines are for what you can talk about and what you can't talk about publicly. And also understanding the health of your company. You certainly aren't going to have huge increases if you're a public employer and you know that there's difficulty balancing a budget, or if you're with a startup and you're just struggling to get by day to day.
That's very fair. That's very fair. Good information. So you did talk about it. We can go ahead and touch upon that piece about the transparency. So how does somebody balance the transparency piece and the compensation decisions with folks about, confidentiality in place as well?
I think it's important, for me at least, for managers to take ownership of those conversations instead of playing the blame game and saying, like, well, the leadership won't let you. I really want to give you an increase, but, and trying to make it more on that buddy or friend level to say, like, I really want to give you this, but they won't let me, or so and so won't let me. So I think, that's one where when you're trying to build that rapport, that isn't a healthy way to do it, because it just still builds that resentment and it kind of can lose trust for you as a leader. So I think understanding what and why things are as transparent as they are, and certainly advocating to your company to have things be more transparent. So many states are now passing pay transparency laws, which I think is bringing us in a right direction to help understand you shouldn't go blindly into a position and have no idea where you're headed. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think it's healthy to publish everybody's salaries without context. So, finding that balance of where things are and how you can move within the range, whether that's a rubric or a criteria, or even understanding, if you're meeting expectations, what you can be doing differently to exceed those to move to that next category of merit increases, if that's how your company does it.
No, that's that's great. I like the not the us versus them. Like I'm on your side, but the company or so and so is not, because it does breed negative kind of I would say negative culture, but it does have a negative impact on things to do it that way. The transparency piece as well. It's like talked about the pay bands being published. I think that's really helpful to have out there. Again, not necessarily with anyone's name and their exact salary next to it, but just a general range so that they understand what makes up kind of the compensation, what helps to earn an increase. So is it based on performance? Is it based on certain criteria? But having that information, I think, is really helpful. And so that's really good information there. So getting into the actual conversation. So one, how should a manager approach and bring up this conversation with employees, and what and how should they handle, I guess what should they do to address maybe a lower than expected increase? So if someone that they're thinking that they're going to get, this 10% raise and they get a 2%, how do you handle that conversation knowing that it's going to be a disappointing conversation from the jump?
Yeah, I think it depends on, I mean, that's the classic HR answer of it depends. It depends on if they're getting 2% where everybody else got 5, and you're having a difficult conversation about them not meeting expectations and maybe needing to change some things in their work life to meet expectations like their coworkers or peers are meeting. If it's truly just, this is where the budget lies and you're doing a great job and this is what we can offer you, I think it's understanding what motivates them beyond that and having those conversations in conjunction with this is why this is happening, whatever the reason may be within the company, budget constraints, prevention of workforce reductions, investments in different areas of the business, like whatever your product or service is that you're offering. But then saying, I want to give you other opportunities to earn in different ways. So that total compensation, like increasing a benefit for that employee or giving them an opportunity for growth so they can make it to the next step of their career faster, attending a conference and getting more networking opportunities. Now, that doesn't replace cold hard cash in your pocket, but it does
Mhm.
help to soften the blow of some of those more disappointing conversations. And I think for a manager, deeply understanding and being able to repeat the why of why that is actually happening in your company is really important so that you don't get nervous or spiral when someone is questioning you or pushing back in those conversations that tend to be difficult.
Oh, that's fair. So, would you say that are there any key phrases or things that a manager should not say when they're discussing compensation?
I think we alluded to this one at the beginning, but certainly not playing the blame game to say HR told me or leadership told me that this is what you're getting and it was completely out of my hands. Even if that is the case, I think that's a difficult place to start from a
Mm.
conversation point because you're not owning that conversation. Certainly not using it as an opportunity to make an excuse for why it's lower. So if someone has good performance and the bucket of money is just smaller that year, not trying to make an excuse to say like, well, you could have done this differently if there truly isn't anything that they could have done to impact their pay. Trying to justify it with like, well, you weren't perfect or whatever that may be, certainly is one area I think can be frustrating. And also allowing that space for the employee to have those emotions. So instead of leading off in a defensive manner, just coming to that with, a very open mind and preparing to have that conversation and acknowledging that it's difficult versus starting really defensively to say, I don't want to hear it. This is what it is. And really like shutting things down right away. So those are a couple. I'm sure there are a million more, but really
That's
going
right.
in there with authentic, like being authentic and open to the conversation.
So no, like suck it up, buttercup kind of thing.
I mean, no, I wouldn't lead with that. I mean, you certainly may think it after you're going round and round and round in some of these conversations that seem endless, but you know the information so much in advance of the employee learning that information. So you've got to give them time to catch up to what they're hearing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it also ties in with what you said at the beginning with if you're meeting with them regularly and often, like you might not know about the budget situation to say this is the exact amounts we're going to be able to give at that time, but based on performance, based on just the overall business success, you can say like we might have a little bit less to play with this year. There's some information to help soften the blow, I think, like you were saying. So another thing, thinking about kind of doing this throughout the year, but are there ways that managers can set appropriate expectations for like future compensation discussions?
Yeah, I think certainly understanding what your company offers as far as other ways to compensate people throughout the year instead of the big one, which is a merit increase.
Mhm.
Are there opportunities for in the moment bonuses or real time rewards for people if they've done a good job on a certain project? Do you have augmentations? I know some companies offer if you're taking on a certain project, your pay can be augmented for a while. So having those kinds of things in the back of your mind to say, I really want to give this person an opportunity to earn money. But also, this is where it goes back to what you want out of a career path and what your next steps are. So making sure you're having those conversations around the areas that need to improve and sort of those individual development plans to get to the next level. Those conversations really drive compensation forward. I'll also say that sometimes you do need to advocate for yourself and your employees. If you're doing your own research, and whether that's from a salary.com or understanding the salary surveys that your company may use, and you say, well, this is coming up a little short. I feel like this person is outperforming someone that's on my team, or, situations where there's compression issues. You've hired someone from the outside and they negotiated a higher salary, and
Mhm.
then you've got a high performer sitting there making less than the newer hire. Those are times when it does make sense to go to your leadership and have those discussions to say, hey, something I want to put on the radar. Is this possible to raise this up? Merit isn't the only compensation change that can happen within a company. You just have to be careful when you're advocating for that and make sure you're coming with clear information other than I just want to do this for someone.
No, that makes sense. And that's good advice. So sometimes there might be some wiggle room to negotiate or to at least get it on the radar to make some changes, but to be a little bit discerning about how to go about it. Because obviously, like you said, no one's going to turn down like, no, thank you. I don't need any more money. I don't want a better
Right.
increase. But everybody is going to ask for one at some point, and not everybody is deserving of one based on performance or level of experience. So be a little bit discerning about how you go about it, but there might be some room to negotiate for those special cases.
Yeah, and I think that's where it goes back to just truly having that deeper understanding of how compensation works in the business that you're in.
No, that makes sense. So I think you talked a little bit about some of those resources using, some of the pay scales and things online. Are there other tools or resources that you would recommend that managers kind of beef up their knowledge about so that they're a little bit more prepared for these conversations?
Yeah, I think understanding, certainly what the internal resources that your company offers. And if you're a smaller company and you don't have internal resources, there's a lot of information out on LinkedIn around comparing salaries for local areas. It's not always the best. You kind of have to understand your industry and then find the tools that make the most sense in what industry you're in. Certainly, if you're comparing like a public sector job to a huge big box store that can afford, massive salaries, you're not going to have the same experience if you're a teacher, in a tiny small town, even versus a teacher in a bigger city. You're going to see those discrepancies. So you really have to understand what market your jobs are in, as well as what resources might be more tied to your specific area of work. The other one I would use is your local HR. Just build a friendly relationship with your HR team. Most of the time we're not scary and we are there to help. This is the fun part of the job, to do that research and have that analytical discussion around what are you thinking? What does the job description look like? What is the career path for this person? There are times when people just max out at a certain level in a certain job. And so that's probably a whole separate topic for you of how to have that conversation when people stagnate at a certain point, to say you either have to grow in breadth and depth or you have to move on, because this is where the buck stops here as far as your salary band.
Hmm. Yeah, that's good, and it's hard, I think, because these conversations it's personal for a lot of folks. So there's a lot of investment and emotion tied into it. So it's one of those situations where you have some rules to play with, but try to do it with some empathy, just because it is very personal to these folks. But really good
Yeah, and
information.
having those conversations, if it is disappointing, to give space to say, I understand that you're disappointed by this. I think there's some research, I don't have the statistic in front of me, where people are happier for only about 6 weeks post an increase in their job. So you have to find things beyond money to continue to motivate and engage your staff and your resources within the company, because getting an increase is very short lived. As soon as you adjust to that on those first couple paychecks, you're like, well, that's been allocated and now I'm looking for the next thing. So
Mhm.
if you're not wanting to have this conversation every 6 to 8 weeks, you also have to look deeper into the things that motivate people beyond money.
That is perfect, and that is like a really great advertisement for what I'm doing with Authentic Foundations. Is that trying to build that culture and try to get that engagement. So thanks, Nicole. That was a nice little plug. Is there anything else that you want to say or share, or anything else that you want to address before we wrap today?
I think we've covered a lot of it today. It's truly just about having the understanding and also going in there as a manager and a leader and not as a friend or a buddy, to have those tough conversations. This is one that can also go really well. So celebrating the wins when you have the opportunity
Yeah.
to say, you're paid below market and we're going to fix that. And here on your next check is your new salary, and helping people understand the why when things positively happen as well, to say we're really advocating you're doing an amazing job and recognizing that. That can be just as rewarding as having some of those more difficult conversations that end up going well if you're seeking kind of mutual understanding.
That's very true. And that's a really good point. So these are not all not negative or neutral conversations. Sometimes they are very positive, and sometimes people are just so excited to receive that increase that that's it. So don't go into it assuming that you're going to have to be prepared for a conversation like this, but this is something where, having learned from experience, I went in one time thinking that it was going to be a positive experience, and the person, I went in very happy and they were very deflated, and then I didn't really know what to do in that moment. So, one, try to read the room, but don't go in there with a preconceived idea of how it's going to go, because you really don't always know exactly how it's going to turn out. But Nicole, thank you very, very much for your time and your years of experience with this, because this was something that I sometimes struggled with, because I had a lot of folks who had questions about compensation and increases. But for everyone else out there, I'm hoping that this was helpful for you, and that this will help you feel a little bit more confident talking to your employees about compensation. There will also be a PDF of some talking points and just some sample phrases that you can use when people have questions, like, why is my peer getting more money than I am? So, some ways to address some of those conversations to make it a bit easier. But thank you very much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time.